everyone, this is Dr. Laura Davis, and I'm just going to give you a short video lecture today on David Suzuki's It Always Cost and E.M. Forster's piece called My Wood. Now, as you know, I'll be away at a conference, so Thursday's class is cancelled for my English 219 Section H. So this little video is in lieu of the class that day. So I do have another video for you on David Suzuki. Please do go ahead and watch that. It's on Blackboard in Module 5. And in addition, I do have some lecture notes for you on My Wood. So please look at those as well, and they will also help you with the interpretation of the text. So a couple things I wanted to say about each of those. David Suzuki, as you know, is a well-known environmentalist and a Canadian environmentalist, and he's written numerous articles and books. He also created the documentary series called The Nature of Things, which is aired on CBC and continues to air. He's a really interesting figure because he has decided not to just be a scientist that writes for other scientists, but to actually be a scientist who writes for the public. So he wants to write in an accessible manner so that the public can understand his scientific ideas. But he does, of course, have a scientific background. In this piece called It Always Costs, the thesis is stated in the title, as well as in the first sentence or paragraph of his essay. And what he's basically saying there is that technology always has a downside or a cost to it. So new technologies that we come out with, they need to be tested, and even with extensive testing, there are sometimes problems with that new technology. So his idea is that we need to be careful about constantly going for new technologies, in the idea that better and newer, or that newer is always better, and that we're always in this movement of progression that is seen as positive. And he says basically we need to take a step back from that idea and remember that often technologies that come out, while we jump on them right away and want to embrace them, there can sometimes be unknown side effects, unknown problems that come to light later. And he gives a number of examples that this is the case. One thing I will say too about his definition of technology is that he doesn't really define it in a clear and succinct way in the essay, but he does imply that technology for him is broad. He wants to give us a broad understanding of technology. So when I think of technology today, I often think of computers and tablets, cell phones, new computer technologies and things like that. But his version of technology, his definition of technology, as I say, is much wider than that. And so he's thinking of pharmaceutical technologies, medical technologies, all sorts of different equipment, and so it's not really limited to just what we might think of when we think of the technological. And some of the examples he gives are of those different types. So one of the examples he talks about is DDT. It was a herbicide that was brought out, and it was used extensively, and then found out later that it had adverse effects on animals. And caused a number of problems up the food chain. And he discusses that in It Always Costs. He always also talks about pharmaceutical technologies and some of the problems, for example, the issue with formaldehyde that happened a number of years ago. So he does talk about lots of examples, and his basic message is that we need to do extensive testing, and to understand that even when we do extensive testing, there can sometimes be some side problems with that technology. And so we need to kind of weigh the benefits and the costs of new technologies as they come out, and whether we jump on embracing them or not. And there are a number of ways we can weigh those pros and cons. He also talks about how to get pharmaceuticals and other new technologies out into the market, and the kind of safeguards we have such as panels of experts that would look at the testing to see if something could be released into the public. And he has a number of things to say about that. So really interesting article. It was written back in the 90s, but it is absolutely relevant today. I also wanted to talk briefly about My Wood by E.M. Forster. So totally separate topic, totally separate essay, but let me just say a few words about that one. So E.M. Forster was writing way back at the beginning of the 20th century, so this is a little bit earlier. I think he was writing in the 1930s, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know the exact date that he wrote this particular essay called My Wood. In it, he talks about his ownership of some land. And the essay becomes a kind of critique of ownership and the effects that it has on our psyche. Now, obviously, people who own land or own property are privileged, and you know, should understand that they're privileged in that sense. But he also talks about basically the psychology, the effects that ownership can have on the psychology. And he makes that very clear at the beginning. He says what the essay is not going to address and what it is going to address. And he clearly talks about how he's going to talk about how owning property affects him as an individual and how it affects others in general. And he has some pretty interesting things to say there. One thing to notice about his essay is that it is structured, unlike many of the other essays that we've studied for this class. Forster's essay is structured almost like you would structure your own kind of academic essay for this course. So in other words, there are topic sentences for each paragraph. He has kind of an explicit thesis statement, and he goes through with single points for each paragraph that he then goes through and shows why the owning property has a negative effect on him, and he believes a negative effect on other people. So when you look at his reasons, you know, he's basically arguing that as I say, that owning property has a negative effect on the individual, and then he gives his reasons through each of the paragraphs. And he's very clear about this. He says, in the first place, it makes me feel heavy. That's his first point. And his second point, in the next paragraph, in the second place, it makes me feel it ought to be larger. So very clear topic sentences. You know, the third one starts in the third place, and then he goes into details to explain each of them. So but the thing that's interesting too is that some of his points, he goes into the metaphorical meaning as well as the literal meaning. So the first one, he says, in the first place, it makes me feel heavy. Well, it makes him feel heavy, literally heavy, but also there's a metaphorical meaning there in that it makes him feel burdened because he's got all of this stuff that he has to take care of. He's got this property that he has to take care of. It makes him feel tied down, if you will, burdened, as if you've got a weight on your shoulders. So this idea of heaviness is both literal, and he talks about the heaviness of a person, but also metaphorical as meaning a kind of burden that he has to take on. In the second paragraph talks about, he says, it makes me feel it ought to be larger. So this is really has to do with greed, right? And he says that once he owns property, it's not enough. You'd think you'd be satisfied for owning property, but psychologically it actually just makes him feel like he wants more of it. He wants it to be larger. And in this is the paragraph in which he talks about the bird that lands on his neighbor's yard property, not his own property. And he kind of says, you know, he was pleased when the bird landed on his property because that meant it was his bird because it was on his property, but then it flies over to Miss Hennessy's yard and he says, wait, that's my bird, you know, as if he owns everything that lands on his property. So then he says, well, to solve this problem, I should just, you know, buy her land, or I shouldn't murder her, I don't think, but I should, you know, so he wants the greed to own it all. So psychologically, owning land makes him not satisfied with what he has, but only wanting more of it. And the bird part is, there's a lot of irony in this essay, and the part where he talks about the bird is pretty ironic because he's making fun of himself, really. He's saying, I should own this bird. Why is this bird flying away from my property? And it's meant, I think, to be funny. He's meant to kind of be poking fun at himself and his own sense of greed. The third paragraph, he says, in the third place, property makes its owner feel that he ought to do something to it. So in this case, he says, again, you would think you'd be satisfied with owning property, but you just want to make it better or different somehow. Sort of like in today's day and age, how everybody's renovating, even before your cupboards are falling off your kitchen, you're renovating because you're bored, or you want it to look different, or you want the newest and the latest. So he says here, restlessness comes over him, a vague sense that he has a personality to express. So he wants to kind of express himself through this. But again, it's like he says, a restlessness. It's a kind of a greed in a sense, although greed really refers to more to the previous paragraph. But he's not satisfied. This fact that he owns property, that he owns things, makes him just want more and different things. And the final paragraph he talks about, he says the final point is the blackberries. Now this is the one that really stands out to me, because all of the other paragraphs, he has reasons that property affects his psyche. But the last paragraph, it's like the one that sticks out, right? It doesn't follow the same logic that the other paragraphs do and the other topic sentences do. He says here, and this brings us to our fourth and final point, the blackberries, as if the blackberries are a point. So really, he's not making a point here. We're left wondering, what the heck does he mean by the blackberries? That's not an argument. That's not a point he's making. He's just named a berry. But I think that here this becomes again sort of metaphorical, and he's talking here about how he's got that there's a public footpath that traverses his property, and so people can steal his blackberries. And that what's he going to do about this? That people in the public can steal the blackberries? He says, should I not let anybody else walk there or what? So I think this is a pretty interesting point as well, because he talks about how he really is he's not talking about this directly, but he's implying that by owning property and fencing off your area from the public, it really works against community, and it works against sharing, and instead it kind of feeds this notion of greed. Instead of wanting to meet the people, for example, that walk on the public footpath, he's separating himself from it, and he's becoming isolated from others because he wants the greed of his own blackberries. And then he has a number of biblical allusions in that last paragraph, which would be pretty interesting to pull apart and talk more about. But I'm not going to do that here. You can do that in your essays if you like, if you're interested in following through with those biblical allusions in the final paragraph. So really interesting essay by E.M. Forster about ownership and the effects of ownership on the psyche and the individual. So that's all for now. It's a very short lecture for you, and I hope you have a good week, and I will see you all next week. Thank you.